I'm George Galloway. I'm the leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, and every week at this time, Wednesday, 8 p.m, I'm talking to our members, our supporters, and those merely interested in our perspectives about the great issues of the day, of the week, of the year, the issues that are unfolding around us month after month and which pose, in some cases, an existential danger to our country. But tonight I want to start with something spiritual. It's the forthcoming radio interview between the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, and the Right Honourable, soon-to-be Sir Tony Blair. That radio interview, conducted by the head of the Church of England, founded on the balls of Henry VIII, is entitled Faith and Morality. Well, who better to talk to about faith and morality than the blood-soaked war criminal, mountebank, profiteer, war profiteer, Tony Blair, a man responsible with George W. Bush for the deaths of more than 1 million people and counting, a man responsible for sending, cascading around the world, the horrors of ISIS, the shot in the arm that Mr. Blair gave to the mass murderers of Al-Qaeda. Who better to talk to about faith and morality than such a man? Luke, of course, made it clear that it will profit a man nothing if he gaineth the whole world and loseth his soul. Well, Tony Blair lost whatever soul he had, I'm sure, but he pretty much has gaineth the whole world, certainly as customers, certainly that part of the world that is ruled by the grimmest of dictatorships. He's made himself a £100 million personal fortune based on the wars that he conducted when in Downing Street. Nice work if you have no soul, or one that you are prepared to sell. So Justin Welby, whose son, incidentally, has a plum job in the various organizations founded by Tony Blair to interfere in political, economic and social affairs all over the world. If you are a third world dictator, you just need to pick up the phone. Maybe the Archbishop of Canterbury's son will answer, or maybe Mr. Blair will answer himself, depending on the size of the potential check. These two jokers are going to be discussing faith and morality. Next week, I understand the Archbishop of Canterbury is hosting a show, Cooking with Satan. But it sums up to me how rotten, how decayed are the formerly great institutions of the British state. Once upon a time, a retired Prime Minister would retire to the House of Lords, where he would duly register his income. That's why Blair's not in the House of Lords, of course. And write his memoirs, make the occasional speech on great national and international matters, and would not trouble us further. Tony Blair, on the other hand, is on the television almost every day of the week on any subject you care to mention. He is popping up on Good Morning Britain to lecture us all about our health and welfare. He's popping up on the BBC at the drop of a hat on any great international crisis. And the Archbishop of Canterbury would once have been a venerable chap who would have stayed 1 million miles away from a mountebank, a war criminal like Tony Blair. But now it just seems like a marriage made in heaven. Speaking of marriages made in heaven, aren't Boris Johnson and his missus a perfect pair? If Boris Johnson could have his time over again, I wouldn't say he wouldn't marry her, that would be too personally intrusive, but he certainly wouldn't have picked her over Dominic Cummings. Since he sent Dominic Cummings packing with a cardboard box full of USBs with all of his secrets on them, he must have been bitterly regretting it. It turns out they had a whopping party in the private flat at 10 Downing Street to celebrate the defenestration of Cummings. They celebrated in haste, and they are repenting in leisure. I've lost count of the number of parties that have been in Downing Street. As a matter of fact, I'm not interested enough even to have counted them in the first place. But there's no doubt that Boris Johnson is in a severe trouble. He is hemorrhaging support amongst Tory voters, amongst Tory members of Parliament, and he has completely lost the journalists and broadcasters who worked so hard, don't forget, to put him into Downing Street in the first place. And I need to accentuate that last point. Boris Johnson has not changed. Boris Johnson has been a liar, a cheat, a deceiver all of his public life, and probably before he entered public life. Boris Johnson is exactly the same man with exactly the same vices that he very clearly and obviously and proven possessed back in 2019. Yet the BBC and ITV and Channel 4 and Sky News and almost all of the newspapers, including the supposed liberal newspapers, did everything, and I mean everything that they could, to ensure that Boris Johnson was our Prime Minister. They contributed, some of them mightily, particularly the liberal ones, to the visceral destruction of the alternative Prime Minister, the then leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, now not even fit to sit in the Parliamentary Labour Party. This cynical turning against Boris Johnson leaves us in the terrible position, though we regard Boris Johnson as just about the worst thing on the earth, to say that those that are trying to destroy him are even more vile than he is. Let me be clear. We do not distinguish between two cheeks of the same arse. We don't prefer Keir Starmer, about whom more in a minute, to Boris Johnson. Not at all. In fact, if anything, a wolf in sheep's clothing is even more dangerous than a wolf. A man who's claiming to be the leader of a Labour Party whilst destroying anything that could remotely be described as Labour is, well, at the very least, more dishonest than the wolf in charge of the Conservative Party. So, if I point out the utter hypocrisy of the Labour leaders, it is not because we prefer Boris Johnson. In fact, we have feelings of only revulsion towards both of them. The difference is we intend, it'll be a long march, but it's begun, to replace Labour in the affections of and the loyalty of the British working people. So don't expect me to choose between the lesser of two evils, even if one could discern which is the lesser of the two evils. And as I've said, that's jolly difficult to do. But when I watched Keir Starmer in the House of Commons this week, I could barely do it, I must tell you. He's not just the block of wood I often describe, the tailor's dummy that I often describe. His voice like a Dalek, like a speak-your-weight machine, simply grates on my ears. I find it very difficult to watch and listen to him, but I did this week. And what I saw was stinking hypocrisy, not just because the Labour leader was himself boozing it up on the parliamentary estate, and I've no doubt elsewhere in the country throughout the pandemic, because I don't believe that Keir Starmer believed the propaganda that he was pouring down the throats of others. I don't believe that Keir Starmer believed that there was anything wrong in going, say, to a mass demonstration of thousands of people in Parliament Square or in Whitehall or in Trafalgar Square in support of the Black Lives Matter organisation to which he took the knee. In fact, I know that he was not against these demonstrations. Many Labour members of Parliament were on these demonstrations. What's the difference between congregating cheek by jowl with thousands of people in Whitehall and taking the knee beside them and having a glass of wine with people that you've been working with all day in the same office? What's the difference between these two things? If we had a proper journalistic caste in this country, this is a question that would be repeatedly asked. As a matter of fact, not just Labour MPs. I see Tobias Ellwood, the latest Tory to turn on Boris Johnson, actually tweeted a picture of a Black Lives Matter gathering in Parliament Square in the most glowing and supportive terms, right in the middle of the lockdown that he is demanding Johnson resign from. Now, I don't want Boris Johnson's resignation. I want Boris Johnson in prison. I want several members of the British cabinet at the time in prison. Not because they were drinking on the job, though everyone who knows me knows how much I deplore the drinking of alcohol at work, especially subsidised alcohol at House of Commons Life on Mars prices. I don't want Boris Johnson in prison for that. I want Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock and others in prison for the grand larceny of public funds, for losing, as they described it this week, £9.4 billion expended on substandard, unusable, lost PPE that was intended to be for our public services. £9.4 billion of public money was literally shredded, ripped up, thrown on a fire by the incompetence and negligence of Boris Johnson and his government, egged on by Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, who saw no problems with anything that Boris Johnson did in the course of the pandemic, except in hindsight, of course. The Labour opposition and the government front bench are jointly and severally responsible for a pandemic which caused the needless deaths of 140,000 people. I say they're responsible because they, in one case, did not take the measures that were necessary and which had been clearly signalled by countries like China before the virus even got here. They are jointly and severally responsible for the state of the National Health Service once the pandemic actually got here. They are jointly and severally responsible for the disastrous state of our health defences through privatisation and underfunding, the part privatisation and full privatisation of National Health Service facilities, the loss of beds because hospitals are saddled with an albatross of debt from the PPIs that the Labour government of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown left them with, the failure of the Tory government to even read, I think, the results of the war game that the NHS did several years before coronavirus arrived into the possibility that we were hit by a coronavirus epidemic, pandemic. In fact, so enfeebled were our health defences revealed in that war game that actually the NHS collapsed in the war game. But nobody did anything about it. Nobody took heed of the warning. That's what I want to see Boris Johnson in prison for, not eating a birthday cake. And of course, there's the issue of outright corruption, never mind negligence, on such a scale that criminal charges are entirely justified. But actual corruption, the VIP track for contracts from the public purse, which the High Court has now already found to be unlawful. What we're going to do about it then, Your Honours? What we're going to do about it, Ms. Dick, or Mrs. Dick, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, whose wife is in charge of investigating partygate. Talk about incestuous relations. What are the police doing about the VIP track found to be unlawful? Why aren't they investigating it? Why aren't they investigating who these VIPs were? How they got these unlawful contracts? And whether or not they were amongst those £9.4 billion worth that simply failed to perform. We're talking about contracts given to people who were the publicans of Conservative cabinet ministers. We're talking about contracts given to actual family members of government ministers. We're talking about contracts given to people who didn't even do that kind of business, but put in a bid and got the gig. We're talking about people who'd never supplied a face mask in their puff that were then given tens of millions of pounds worth of contracts to supply face masks, many of which didn't work, some of which got lost. These people were picked not because they were VIPs, but because they were Tory cronies. Their mouths were stuffed with gold in the expectation that some of that gold would come back to the Conservative Party, either in party donations or in foreign holidays for the Prime Minister, or in redecorating his apartments, or any number of other potentially corrupt acts. That's what I want to see the Tories on trial for. But don't ask me to back Keir Starmer's utter rancid hypocrisy. He claims that Johnson is responsible for anything that happens in 10 Downing Street, but that he is not responsible for the department of which he was head not to prosecute Jimmy Savile. They're all clucking like maiden ants at Johnson, socking them on the jaw with the fact that during Keir Starmer's time as the head of the prosecution authority in Britain, there was more time spent prosecuting journalists, Julian Assange, anyone, than Jimmy Savile. Sir Jimmy Savile. Like Sir Tony Blair. What a pity he's no longer with us. The Archbishop of Canterbury could have interviewed him about morality and faith, but I digress. The facts are that if Johnson's responsible for the behaviour of his staff in 10 Downing Street, Keir Starmer is responsible for the fact that his department did not prosecute Jimmy Savile. That's a simple statement of fact. He says he was not the lawyer doing the reviewing of this case. Well, why wasn't he? Jimmy Savile was a close associate of our royal family. He was a knight of the realm. He had been investigated for horrific sex crimes. Why didn't the director of public prosecution take a close interest in whether or not he should be prosecuted or not? Look, I could go on, but I must move to my last subject this evening because my wife is indicating I'm running out of time and testing your patience. The situation in Ukraine, on the Russian-Ukraine border, on the Belarus-Ukraine border, and in some, but by no means all, of the Eastern European satrapies of NATO, is going from bad to worse from the perspective of the NATO war machine. Well, first of all, they've had to bear a visit from the pound shop Churchill, Boris Johnson, having had to bear a visit from the pound shop Margaret Thatcher, somebody called Liz Truss, who is apparently our Foreign Secretary. But one after the other, these countries are beginning to say, include us out. Hungary wants no part of it. Bulgaria wants no part of it. Slovakia wants no part of it. Croatia wants no part of it. But much more importantly, Germany and France want no part of it. The Germans are refusing to allow their airspace to be used by anybody to fly weapons to Kiev. The French President Macron has just this day publicly almost entirely broken with the US narrative in Ukraine. He sees no evidence that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. He doesn't believe that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. And of course, he's right. Why would Russia want to invade Ukraine? The only circumstances in which a single Russian boot will appear in Ukraine is if the pumped full of arms by NATO, Ukrainian armed forces launch a major offensive against the people that were promised in the Minsk agreement, to which Western powers are a signatory, that they can be autonomous republics. It's one thing not actually implementing the Minsk agreement, but if Ukrainian forces were to launch a massive assault causing widespread death and destruction amongst Russian people in eastern Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of them Russian citizens, then of course Russia will come to their defense. But the Ukrainian government wouldn't do such a thing, would it? They wouldn't allow the Azov battalion and the other jackbooted, swastika parading neo-fascists, worshippers of the Holocaust mass murderer Bandera. They wouldn't allow them to do that, would they? And if they did, Western democracies wouldn't allow them to do that, would they? Not using the weapons that they had supplied, would they? All these Western journalists wouldn't stand idly by while that was happening, would they? Anyway, as I speak, Joe Biden has just announced the sending of thousands of American troops to Poland. If I was President Putin, I'd send exactly the same number of troops right now to Cuba, to Venezuela, to Nicaragua. I'd ask Iran if they wanted Russian anti-missile capability manned by Russian experts. I'd ask Syria if they wanted additional Russian troops with the permission to fire anti-aircraft, anti-missile defenses, on the principle that here's some of your own medicine back, Joe. Medicine and Joe. Would you send him out for a loaf? Are you really going to allow the potential existence of humanity on the planet to be in the hands of such a man? The only button that Joe Biden should have his finger on is his coat button, and probably not even that. Well, I'm going to settle down to listen to the desert warfare discs between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the blood-soaked war criminal, Tony Blair. If you're interested in what we have to say, follow us, contact us, join us. We've a long way to go, but we are the future now, I promise you. I'm George Galloway, and we are the Workers' Party of Britain.